This is Catholic Forum. I'm Bob Krebs. Dr. Thomas D. Williams has written widely on theology, philosophy, ethics, and spirituality, and his 15 books include Who is My Neighbor?, Personalism and the Foundations of Human Rights, and The World as It Could Be, Catholic Social Thought for a New Generation. Dr. Williams teaches theology at St. John's University in Rome, and he comes to us today from Rome, Italy. Dr. Williams, welcome to Catholic Forum. We're going to be talking about your great book, The Coming Christian Persecution. But before we get into that, if you would please give us a few examples of how Christian persecution is taking place around the world this time.
There are several drivers of Christian persecution right now. Atheistic communism continues to be one. So if you go to places like North Korea, where it's completely illegal to be a Christian, you can be thrown in jail or even killed for having a Bible or for speaking with another person about Jesus. In China, where it's theoretically legal to be a Christian, but it's so controlled by the Communist Party there that they have microphones and cameras within churches. They've just introduced the need for an app. You have to reserve anytime you want to go to church so the government can know how often you go, when you're going, what church you're going to. And they also monitor the preaching to make sure that it coincides with the Marxist ideology of the state. That's just one type. If you go to places like Nigeria, where it's the most dangerous country in the world to be a Christian today, in the sense that you're most likely to be killed, there are hundreds of deaths of Christians every year who are targeted simply because they're Christians. And in this case, the driver is different. Here it's not atheistic communism, but here it's a radical extreme form of Islam. And this is repeated around the world. In fact, 9 of the 10 countries where it's most dangerous to be a Christian today are actually Muslim majority nations. And this is not obviously to condemn all Islam, but right. Certainly in the case of its extreme forms, as we've seen, it's extremely dangerous. So this is something, if we look around the world, if you go to India, you've got Hindu nationalism. There's a lot of violence now against Christians there, where Christians are looked upon as suspicious because they bring with them a so-called Western religion. They're not looked upon as true Indians, true members of the Indian state, because they're not Hindu. And this is repeated over and over again. If we look in the Western world, there's a more insidious, if you will, form, less direct, but more insidious form of persecution, where Christians more and more, despite the fact that we live in a post-Christian society and the founding values of our nations were Christian, at the same time, Christians now who take their faith seriously are looked upon as kind of enemies of the secular state. They're looked upon with a hostility that they bring too rigid a morality, that they're going to question the trends that are happening in modern society and in holding back progress in a way. So Christians are now looked upon often as bigots. They're looked upon and called as obscurantists or back-looking when they're just trying to be faithful to Jesus Christ and the morality that he preached. So that's a bit of an overview.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about Nigeria, if you would, please. John Enemwa is one of our Diocese of Wilmington transitional deacon, is going to be ordained to the priesthood in this spring. And he is from Nigeria. He's going to be on the program in a few weeks, but you say that it's the cause of that persecution is from a radical Islamic group. But is the government also behind that persecution, or is it mostly just persecution from fellow Nigerians who happen to be of this Islamic sect?
All right, that's a really good question. The government has been, in fact, the bishops of that nation have spoken out over and over again against the complicity of the government in the persecution. The outgoing president of the nation, President Buhari, Muhammadu Buhari, who just left, was a member of the Fulani ethnic group. The Fulani Muslims, mostly in the center of the country, have been responsible for some of the most vehement attacks on Christians. It's really between the Fulani Muslims, sometimes they're called herders or tribesmen, sometimes called raiders or militants, which I think is actually more accurate in this case. You've also got the Boko Haram group up in the north, which is responsible for a lot of the killing in the north. But yes, the government has been complicit as well, mostly because it has refused to do anything. There are arrests made, there is no prosecution, there is no real search for justice in the case of a lot of these tribal killings.
Another country that's been getting a lot of attention recently is Nicaragua. And you would think Nicaragua, being a Central American country, would be a mostly Catholic Christian country. But talk a little bit about the persecution there, if you would, please.
Yeah, that's a tragic situation. It is predominantly Catholic, but just in these very, very days that we're talking about, the president, the dictator, actually is what he is, Daniel Ortega of the Sandinista group, expelled the nuncio. He cut off diplomatic relations with the Holy See, basically because he had heard that in a recent interview, Pope Francis had said that his dictatorship is very similar to Hitler's, and this did not go over well. So he immediately announced that he was cutting off diplomatic ties with the Vatican. But this is just the latest. He kicked out Missionaries of Charity, Mother Teresa's group. He kicked out actually the Apostolic Nuncio last year. He has arrested the Bishop of Matagalpa, Rolando Alvarez, who is now in a dark prison, and it's a prison where reportedly torture is very, very common. He banished 8 priests in this last year and removed their Nicaraguan citizenship. It's just an ongoing bunch of aggression and hostilities toward the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church has had the courage to stand up to some of the atrocities perpetrated by his government.
You mentioned also some of the maybe the less obvious persecution that Western countries are experiencing. In Delaware, there's a bill to do away with the priest penitent privilege in confession as it applies to child abuse. Do you think that's an example of this type of persecution? And some priests in history have been martyred because they wouldn't give up that priest penitent, the sacredness of the privilege between priest and penitent.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's a very clear example of that sort of persecution. And I think that, in reality, I think people that bring these bills forward, first of all, they know that the Catholic Church is not going to cave on this. It's simply not going to happen. And they use it as a stick with which to beat the church, because they say, look, they're protecting these abusers. They are looking for a way, which we know is not true. And by the way, it has been said over and over again, and members of the church have been very forthcoming about this. If you ever were to, well, you're obliged to reveal what was told to you in the confessional if it has to do with this abuse, no one would ever confess it. And knowing this, it's meant to be a sanctuary between the person and God, and the priest is obviously they're just a conduit really between God and the soul. And so it is not something that is meant to be in any way public. But to bring that forward is, I think, meant as a hostile action against the church. It's meant to be something they can say, aha, look, they're not giving in because they have something to hide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Are there some other examples of Christian persecution right here in the United States that you can give us?
Oh, sure. One great example, I think, is what we've seen the last few years. When people are up for a public office, in the case of judgeships in particular. Mm-hmm. Just to take one example of Amy Coney Barrett in 2017, when she was first named to be a judge on the district court before she was made Supreme Court justice. The grilling and the hazing that she received from the Senate Judiciary Committee was terrible, and it was done in the name of religion. Senator Dianne Feinstein famously said, one gets the sense, and looking at what you've written, what you say, that the dogma lives loudly in you. Yeah. And this disqualifying aspect, if you're a serious believer, then you might not be able to be unbiased enough to actually judge. And that's something that's very dangerous as a precedent, to start looking at faith as a disqualifying condition or dimension of a person. If you're very, very devoted to your faith, that in some way you're going to be less as a citizen, you're going to be less as a judge, you're going to be less as a public servant. And that is something that obviously flies in the face of our entire American history, but it's something that's more and more prevalent now.
Yeah, I mean, even the FBI has come out with memos to kind of keep an eye on some what they call like fundamental Catholics, that there might even be some equated to some sort of terrorist activity. That to the FBI's credit, they've retracted that, but that's kind of scary when you think about that.
It's very scary. And they retracted it under duress. I mean, they retracted it once the story was out because it looked terrible. They were talking about, traditional or conservative Catholics who prefer the Latin Mass, or like they're, dangerous members of society, as if, whatever you think about the liturgy wars, if you will, or the liturgical question, there's certainly no connection there with white supremacy or Christian nationalism, or these buzzwords that we're hearing today, which are honestly, at least as far as I can tell, really an invention as a way to just kind of, tar serious Christians with these, as if they're trying to make a theocracy out of the United States, which has never been the case. The United States was founded on religious freedom. People came to our country because they wanted to escape the tyrannies that were obliging them to follow the Church of England. Those were the first pilgrims. They were looking for a place where they could worship freely. And the scary thing is now that it seems we've come 180 degrees, and now to be a Christian is to be looked upon with suspicion, as if you're actually part of the problem.
I think Christians have been persecuted since Calvary. I mean, it's part of the I guess it's part of the deal when you become a Christian, that you're going to expect some sort of persecution along the way. It's a little bit unusual, I would think, in our country recently. But what do you think are the root causes of this Christian persecution?
Well, I think it's usually when Christianity gets in the way of something. So in the case of totalitarian states, this kind of dual allegiance, if you have allegiance to a God that is not the state, this goes all the way back to the times of the Roman Empire, but we can see it again, for example, under atheistic communism, then that's a problem. You have this dual allegiance when the state wants all of you. But other times, in the case of radical secularism, for example, it is Christian morality many times. If you're not going along with the way things are changed, the things that are more and more accepted by the general population, then you are a stumbling block. You're in the way, again, of progress, and you have to be gotten out of the way. Your beliefs are now kind of a hindrance to the way people think that morality should be going, whether it has to do with the reality of marriage, or men and women and their identity as made by God as men or women, whether it's about abortion or any one of the social questions that are coming up today. Christianity is looked upon more and more as a little bit backward looking, and I think that this is something that seems like a hostile situation for those who are really beholden to this radical secularism.
Yeah. How bad do you think it'll get?
Well, there's certainly no signs of it getting better. One of the main theses of this book, The Coming Christian Persecution, is that things will definitely get worse before they get better. And the reason is that the drivers of persecution are not abating. They're not diminishing. And at the same time, the traditional defenders of Christianity in the West are losing their force and losing their will to do that. Part of that is people are unaware of the prevalence of the problem and how widespread it is, in part because the mainstream media simply choose not to cover it. This is something that we hear very, very little about, unless people are interested and follow maybe one of these Christian persecution monitoring groups. But otherwise, you're just not hearing about this on the nightly news.
So what can the average Christian, the other average Catholic in the pew, what can we do to help to avoid persecution, and then also to help the persecuted?
Well, I think the thing is that, we can easily become complacent if we think, well, the thing is not affecting me, and go about our daily business, and not really have the solidarity that we're called to have with our brothers and sisters in the faith. And I think the first thing we can do, obviously, is pray for them. And that's not just, something that has to be said. It's a reality that we actually believe in. This is our bread and butter, that it really makes a difference, and to stand shoulder to shoulder with them, firstly in prayer. I think we also need to be courageous in our own lives, because I think in every life of every Christian, every Catholic, there are opportunities that we have to bear witness to Jesus, and sometimes we choose not to do so because of the fallout if we do. And I think that practicing that courageous stand to really say what needs to be said, do what needs to be done, and to be true to our faith, that is also showing a willingness to be the kind of witnesses that Jesus expects us to be. I think that there are many other virtues that Christians are called to have in preparation for martyrdom, maybe that will never come, but that's something that we should know is a part and parcel with Christianity itself.
That's interesting. How can we be prepared for martyrdom?
Again, I think it's in the little, in a season like this, a season of Lent, those penitential acts that we do are really like going to a spiritual gym, building our spiritual muscles and getting ready for whatever it is that God may ask of us. And I think that the more we're kind of in control of ourselves and used to giving something up for God when we're free to do so, I think it'll make it more likely that we're able to do so when our back is up against the wall and something's being taken from us. And I think none of us can ever be sure. We have to pray for the grace to endure, whatever comes, and to be there, faithful to Jesus. And the more we're faithful to him on a daily basis in our daily lives, the more likely it is that we'll be faithful to him, when the rubber hits the road, if it ever gets really, really rough.
So how did this book come about? What made you decide to write this book?
Well, I've been covering this aspect for years now as a journalist. I've been writing on it. I've been following it. And it just has really struck me as something that is so unknown. It's something that people are not aware of. And I think that sometimes a bit like the frog in the water that gets hotter and hotter, we don't realize the world is changing around us and how problematic it's becoming. And I think that I wanted this to be kind of a wake-up call for Christians and Catholics to really understand the depth of the problem and to prepare. And I think also, we really have to fight for our religious freedom. We can't take it for granted. This is something that's now really under fire. Conscience exemptions, for example, in the medical field and other areas, and so many other manifestations of this. We really need to hold up religious freedom as the first of our freedoms, as the founders intended it.
Yeah. Do you see any topics or any countries where you see, perhaps we're headed toward some additional persecution that we should be on the lookout for?
Well, I think that, in the West, I think we look a little bit north of our borders. Canada has been terrible on this. And I think that another recent wake-up call was the whole COVID pandemic and the way that the government saw fit to move in and kind of coerce churches into closing and to, think that they had the ability to tell Christians whether they could go to church, whether they were allowed to worship in public, and just exactly what they could do. This is something that I found personally a little bit scary. And I think that once you get a taste of that ability to control religion and to control people of faith, then it becomes very, very tempting to use that again for any other reason, whether it's, it could be anything. It could be climate change. It could be not going along with some government program that in good conscience we can't go along with. Whatever it might be, I think that the temptation is there for the state to become, very to usurp the authority and the autonomy that churches should have.
Yeah. What do you want your readers to take away from the book?
Well, I'd like to be better informed about the nature of the problem, to be able to recognize it when they see it, and to realize just how broad it is and what it looked like. But I'd also like, and I dedicate the entire last chapter to this, a real more spiritual preparation. I think that as Christians, we need to take these things very much to prayer and very much to heart and conform our lives to the gospel. And part of that we do by looking at the example that Jesus gave us and his own, predictions for his apostles. He told us, this is the cross. You're going to have to pick it up every day. And he warned against persecution. If they hated me, they're going to hate you too. You are not of this world. And so these are things I think that the book is meant to help bring home to light and really make something more personal.
And how can our listeners get a copy of the book?
Well, it's published through that wonderful organization, Sophia Institute Press, and you can find it on their website. It's also available on Amazon.com. I have a website, www.thomasdwilliams.com, where you can find this and other books that I've written. So it should be pretty easy if people would like to get it.
Well, Dr. Williams, thanks so much for being with us today on Catholic Forum, and have a beautiful rest of your Lent and a wonderful Easter season.
Thank you. The same to you. Blessings on you and your family.